The war in the air began with confidence and ended in exhaustion. In 1942, the skies over Europe belonged to the Germans. Their fighters owned the daylight, their flak ruled the clouds, and their cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, seemed unreachable fortresses to the men flying out of England. The Royal Air Force and the U.S. 8th Air Force could send bombers deep into occupied France, sometimes even to the Ruhr, but beyond that, the distance was too great. Pilots knew the cruel arithmetic of range. Every mile forward meant a mile fewer coming home. The Allies built magnificent bombers, heavy, powerful, bristling with guns, but none could carry enough fuel to fly from Britain to Berlin and back without help. Escort fighters like the Spitfire and the early P-47 Thunderbolt were even worse off. They were fast, deadly, but short-legged. Their fuel gauges were the limits of Allied strategy. Each time the bombers crossed the Rhine, their fighter escort would turn back. Beyond that invisible line, the B-17s and B-24s were alone. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Dozens of sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dove in from above, tearing into the defenseless formations. The skies over Germany became slaughterhouses of aluminum. Crews called it the long, dark stretch, the part of the mission when the escorts had to go home and the bombers had to go on. Commanders knew the math. Loss rates reached 30% on some raids. Whole squadrons vanished into the haze. The brass called it unsustainable. The men called it suicide. But there was no alternative, because there was no fuel. That was the wall the Allies kept hitting, the limits of reach. And then, almost quietly, came an idea so small and so obvious that no one had paid any attention at all. It began with the simplest thought. If the fighter couldn't carry enough gas inside, why not hang some outside? The concept wasn't new. Pilots in earlier wars had experimented with auxiliary tanks, but they were crude, improvised, unreliable, prone to leaks or worse, explosions. Most engineers dismissed them as dangerous clutter. But in late 1942, a handful of mechanics at British and American airfields began to revisit the idea with desperation rather than theory. They built crude, detachable fuel tanks that could be jettisoned once empty. They weren't armored. They weren't elegant. They were, quite literally, tin cans full of aviation fuel. The British called them drop tanks. The Americans called them belly tanks. The Germans, when they began finding them littered across fields, called them gift bombs. Whatever the name, they changed everything. A drop tank was the simplest piece of engineering imaginable. A thin metal or sometimes paper shell, fitted with a fuel line and a release lever. When full, it made a fighter heavier and slower, but once empty, the pilot could pull a handle and let it fall away, regaining speed. It added hundreds of miles to a fighter's range, miles that meant the difference between turning back at the Rhine and escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. At first, no one believed it could work. The Air Ministry hesitated. The U.S. Army Air Forces scoffed. The tanks were flimsy, vulnerable to gunfire, and could throw off the aircraft's balance if jettisoned incorrectly. But war doesn't wait for perfection. The need was too great. In the spring of 1943, experimental units began flying P-47 Thunderbolts with the new tanks slung under their wings. The first missions were shaky. Leaks were common, valves froze in the cold, and more than one pilot came back soaked in high-octane fuel. But the results were undeniable. The Thunderbolts flew deeper than they ever had before. Engineers refined the design almost overnight. Some tanks were made of aluminum, others of steel, and in a stroke of wartime ingenuity, some were even made of compressed paper coated in glue and resin. Cheap, disposable, and invisible to radar. They cost less than a crate of ammunition, but they bought something priceless: range. Suddenly, the sky map of Europe began to change. The fighters that once had to abandon the bombers now followed them to the edge of Germany. The Luftwaffe, used to striking defenseless targets, found itself ambushed by escorts that shouldn't have been there. The tables began to turn. One American pilot described the feeling the first time he crossed into Germany with a full load of extra fuel. We looked around and realized we were still with the bombers. The sky felt different that day, like someone had finally turned the lights on. By the end of 1943, drop tanks were no longer an experiment. They were policy. Factories in Britain and America churned them out by the tens of thousands. Mechanics learned to bolt them onto fighters in minutes. For the first time, Allied aircraft had true strategic reach. And that reach pointed to one city, Berlin. To the Allied High Command, Berlin wasn't just a target. It was the heart of the enemy, the nerve center, the symbol, the city Hitler swore could never be touched. Reaching it was more than military strategy. It was psychological warfare. But to reach it safely, the bombers needed guardians all the way there and back. The drop tanks made that dream real. The P-47 Thunderbolt led the way, its massive frame carrying twin tanks under the wings. Soon the sleeker, faster P-51 Mustang arrived. Born in Britain, perfected in America, married to a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that made it sing at 30,000 feet. With its streamlined body and drop tanks, the Mustang could now fly from England to Berlin, dogfight over the city, and return home. The first mission to Berlin with full escort took place in March 1944. Hundreds of bombers roared across northern Germany, braced for the usual nightmare. But this time, the Luftwaffe's ambushes met something new. Out of the sunlight came the long-nosed silhouettes of P-51s, faster, higher, angrier than anything the Germans expected. The air battle that followed shattered the illusion of German control. Dozens of enemy fighters fell. The bombers reached Berlin and turned the city's factories into rubble. The cheap, ugly little tanks strapped under the wings had done the impossible. They had carried Allied air power into the enemy's heart. To the public, it looked like another triumph of industrial might. But to the men who knew, it was a miracle of simplicity. Each tank was disposable, barely worth the metal it was made from. And yet, in those thin skins of steel and paper lay the death warrant of the Luftwaffe. From that moment on, the Germans were fighting a war they could no longer win. Every raid reached deeper. Every escort stayed longer. The sky that had once belonged to the Reich now belonged to the fuel gauge, and the Allies had just rewritten it. The world remembered the planes, the pilots, the battles. But few remembered the small, unglamorous piece of hardware that made it all possible. The thing that didn't look like a weapon at all. It was, after all, just a gas tank. And yet, it was that cheap little gas tank that let pilots reach Berlin and change the course of the war. When the bombers finally reached Berlin and came home again, everything changed. Commanders who had spent 2 years writing condolence letters suddenly began to plan offensives instead of defenses. The pilots who once counted minutes of fuel like seconds of life now looked down at gauges that gave them room to fight. Range meant freedom, and freedom meant control. The Luftwaffe realized it too late. For years, German doctrine had been built on the idea that Allied bombers would always come alone in the deep skies. The defenses were calibrated for that pattern. Radar stations would track formations, interceptors would scramble, and swarms of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts would carve through the bombers long before they reached the capital. But now, the radar screens told a different story. The bombers came as usual, but the dots that accompanied them stayed longer, moved faster, and turned toward the hunters instead of away from them. The first time German pilots met Mustangs over Berlin, disbelief replaced arrogance. They had seen escorts before, but never here, never this deep. The P-51s dove like falcons, closing from altitude with impossible speed. The Luftwaffe had been forced into a defensive fight it could not win. Its pilots were veterans, but veterans of ambush, not of duels that stretched hundreds of miles from their own bases. That was the new logic of the air war. Whoever could stay in the sky longest ruled it. And the drop tank gave the Allies hours the Germans didn't have. From that spring onward, the U.S. 8th Air Force built its campaign around the extended reach of its fighters. The P-47s and P-51s no longer turned back halfway. They rode with the bombers all the way to the target, then lingered behind to hunt anything that dared follow. The escort mission turned into a pursuit mission. Instead of defending, the Mustangs began to seek the Luftwaffe. Pilots called it sweeping the decks. After each bombing run, squadrons of P-51s would fan out across the countryside, strafing airfields, trains, and convoys. Every gallon of fuel they carried beyond the return limit became ammunition against an enemy already bleeding from shortage. And each of those gallons came from the cheap, expendable tanks bolted under their wings. The change in morale was electric. Before the tanks, Bomber crews had felt like passengers in a slow-moving death march, straight lines of aircraft flying into a wall of flak. Afterward, they flew with an invisible shield. They began to notice something strange during missions: the absence of fear. When you know someone is up there fighting for you, the sky feels bigger. The Mustangs carried that promise on their wings. The pilots who flew them were mostly young, barely 20, but they became legends overnight. Names like George Preddy, John Meyer, and Don Blakesley filled mess hall talk and newspaper columns. They didn't call themselves heroes. They said, "We just got more gas than they do." Back in the factories, engineers kept refining the tanks. Early models had been simple steel drums with seams that leaked under stress. Later versions were streamlined to reduce drag, fitted with quick-release valves that dumped the empty shells cleanly away from the fuselage. Each improvement meant longer reach, smoother flight, more precision. Some tanks were made of phenolic resin and pressed paper, so cheap they were used once and thrown away. Crews joked that they could build a war out of rubbish. But the effect was devastating. In the first 6 months of 1944, German aircraft losses soared. Every time a squadron took off to defend a city, they found Mustangs waiting for them. The hunters had become the hunted. By the summer, the Luftwaffe's best aces were gone, shot down or grounded for lack of fuel. The skies that had once been a shield for the Reich turned into an open graveyard of smoke trails and parachutes. Inside German command posts, the panic was visible in ink. Memos flooded upward from airfield commanders begging for fuel, for replacements, for time. None of it came. The Allied air strategy had shifted. It was no longer about bombing cities. It was about destroying the Luftwaffe itself. And every sortie that went deeper into Germany proved that the strategy was working. The drop tank wasn't glamorous, but it had done something that thousands of pilots, millions of bullets, and entire fleets of bombers had failed to do. It had stripped the Luftwaffe of the initiative. By June 1944, on the eve of D-Day, the Germans could no longer contest the skies over France. The invasion force crossed the Channel under a canopy of Allied fighters: P-47s, P-38s, and above all, P-51s, each carrying their stubby metal lifelines beneath the wings. The Luftwaffe barely appeared. It wasn't courage they lacked. It was fuel, aircraft, and time. When the first reports from Normandy reached Berlin, Göring reportedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "Where is the Luftwaffe?" His generals didn't answer. They knew where it was. It was burning on its own airfields, hunted down by fighters that should never have been able to reach them. The Germans had once prided themselves on technical superiority. Their engines were masterpieces, their aerodynamics cutting edge. But the war had turned into a contest of logistics, not luxury. And logistics favored simplicity. The Allies could afford to mass-produce throwaway gas tanks. Germany couldn't. That imbalance was more fatal than any dogfight. Every paper tank rolling out of an English workshop meant another pilot who could make it home. The beauty of the invention lay in its humility. It didn't require new factories, exotic materials, or classified projects. It was an idea anyone could have had, but only desperation forced someone to act on it. It was proof that the smallest innovation, if used with vision, can tilt the axis of war. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow. Its veteran pilots were dead or captured, its replacements barely trained. The Allies owned the daylight. Even the night, fighters struggled against radar-guided intruders. The bomber routes to Berlin, once lined with fire, now glittered only with the steady glow of formation lights. When the first waves of bombers dropped their loads on the city's industrial districts, there was no longer any question of reach. The distance that had once been measured in fuel was now measured in inevitability. The war that had started on the ground had been decided in the air, and it was decided by a cylinder of metal no longer than a man's leg. The post-mission debriefs tell the human side of that miracle. Pilots described looking out at the empty pylons where their tanks had once hung and realizing that those cheap shells of fuel had carried them into history. Mechanics in England sifted through scrapyards filled with used tanks and laughed at the irony. They had built the most important part of a fighter plane from the part that wasn't even meant to return. Commanders took notice too. Reports from 8th Air Force headquarters began to use new language. They no longer spoke of losses parade. They spoke of control of the air. The cheap little gas tank had given them that control. It was the hinge between hope and dominance, between barely reaching the front line and crossing the enemy's heartland. When the war planners looked ahead to the next campaign, across the Rhine, into the final collapse of Germany, they saw the sky as their own. The pilots who once dreaded the words "deep strike" now smiled when they heard them. They knew what it meant. Another chance to prove that distance was no longer a limit, just a number. The Germans had built their empire on speed and precision. The Allies had beaten it with endurance, and endurance at 30,000 feet was measured in gallons. Gallons that came from those humble tanks. And that's how a scrap of metal, barely worth its weight in steel, became the silent partner of every victory from 1944 onward. When peace finally came, the airfields of Europe were filled with the ghosts of the war's machines. The steel carcasses of bombers, the scorched shells of fighters, the long runways cracked by the weight of victory. Mechanics packed up their toolboxes. The pilots, the ones who had survived, went home to the quiet shock of silence. But the lessons they carried with them, those stayed. One of those lessons was range. The ability to reach farther than the enemy, to strike from beyond his horizon, to never again be limited by fuel. It was the kind of truth that once learned could never be forgotten. And it had been written in a history not by theory or technology, but by something as cheap and humble as a drop tank. Every major air force studied the phenomenon. They understood that the war had not been won by the fastest plane or the heaviest gun, but by the one that could stay in the sky the longest. Endurance had beaten engineering. The Luftwaffe had lost not because its aircraft were inferior. They weren't, but because their reach was too short. The Allies could cross oceans. The Germans could barely cross borders. The post-war years were an age of reflection for aviation. Jet engines were on the horizon. Radar was advancing. But the most influential diagrams in those years were not of wings or engines. They were of fuel systems. The drop tank doctrine, as some engineers called it, became standard practice. Every fighter design that followed, from the first jet interceptors to the Cold War's supersonic guardians, was drawn around the assumption that extra fuel would be carried outside the fuselage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was freedom. The Mustang, the P-47, and the late-model Spitfires that had once used drop tanks became the templates for a new generation of aircraft. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, the Meteor, all of them carried detachable tanks under their wings. Even in peacetime, every pilot knew the ritual of flying heavy with fuel, dropping the tanks before a dogfight, and feeling the aircraft come alive again. That single motion, the pull of the jettison lever, was the inheritance of 1944. The idea spread beyond combat. Long-range reconnaissance, maritime patrol, even commercial aviation borrowed it. The engineers who designed the first transatlantic jets admitted that their fuel calculations came from the old escort missions to Berlin. The logic was eternal. Speed gives you power, but range gives you choice. In Washington, analysts at the newly formed U.S. Air Force began to study the final months of the European campaign. The conclusion startled even the generals. The air war, they said, had turned the moment the fighters gained the ability to escort bombers all the way to the target. It wasn't radar or rockets that had broken the Luftwaffe. It was fuel. More specifically, the ability to carry it where it was needed most, and then throw it away. That single principle, carry what you need, discard what you don't, became the foundation of post-war air strategy. The Cold War would take it to its extreme. By the 1950s, the New World Order was being drawn not on maps, but on flight charts. The United States built vast networks of bases across the Atlantic and Pacific, each one chosen for its position within refueling range. Every jet, every bomber, every reconnaissance mission depended on the old math of endurance. And yet, when the distances grew too long for even the biggest fuel tanks, the old drop tank principle evolved again into flying refuelers. The aerial tanker was, in spirit, a drop tank that never dropped. It kept aircraft alive in the air for hours, days even. The humble wartime invention had become the backbone of modern air power. And somewhere behind all that progress, the men who had first hung those crude cylinders under the wings of Thunderbolts and Mustangs watched with quiet pride. They knew what the textbooks didn't say, that the great revolutions of technology rarely announce themselves. They begin with a mechanic holding a wrench and thinking, what if we just give it more fuel? In the archives of the Air Ministry and the Pentagon, engineers began to talk about range parity. It was a phrase that meant victory. If you could reach the enemy, but he couldn't reach you, you didn't just win battles. You won strategies. You dictated where and when the fight happened. You owned the clock. The Cold War fighters embodied that logic perfectly. Sleek, fast, and lethal, they all carried detachable tanks as standard equipment. In photographs of air patrols from the 1960s, you can still see them, under the wings of F-100s, F-105s, and even the mighty F-4 Phantom. Sometimes, those tanks were painted bright silver, sometimes dull gray, but they were always there, quiet reminders of the war that had taught the world that fuel was life. The Soviets did the same. Their MiGs and Sukhois sprouted tanks like second skins. In dogfights over Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, pilots still began every engagement by dropping the heavy shells before they turned to fight, each one falling away like a salute to the past. What few people realized was how much the psychological balance of air warfare had changed because of them. Before the drop tank, every pilot flew with the ticking clock of fuel in his head, a constant dread of the moment when the gauge dipped too low and the choice became return or die. After the tank, that fear receded. The sky grew larger. Tactics became bolder. The entire culture of air combat shifted from caution to aggression. Historians would later say that the Allies won the war in Europe through numbers, through production, manpower, and industry. But the numbers themselves tell a subtler story. Between 1943 and 1945, Allied aircraft production increased by 40%. Fuel production by more than 60%. The numbers weren't about machines. They were about distance. The machines existed to use the fuel, and the fuel existed to reach the target. Berlin had been the test case. After that, range became the measure of ambition. Once you've learned that you can reach the heart of your enemy, you never forget how. In that sense, the drop tank didn't just change a war. It changed the human relationship with the sky. It turned the impossible into the routine. It made continents feel smaller. It made the idea of global reach real. When the jet age came, and later the space age, those same engineers carried the same thought forward. Carry what you need, jettison what you don't. It's the same principle that guides rockets leaving Earth today, the same logic of temporary fuel and permanent motion. In museums now, the drop tanks hang beneath the wings of restored Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Visitors rarely notice them. They look plain, almost decorative. Children walk past, eyes drawn instead to the guns or the polished propellers. But for the veterans who stand in those halls, the tanks are what matter most. They were the reason the bombers reached their targets, the reason they came home, the reason the war ended sooner than it might have. Every time a Mustang takes to the sky at an air show, you can still see them, twin pods glinting in the sunlight, the same way they did 80 years ago over Germany. They are silent now, but in their silence lies the echo of the thousands of engines that once roared toward Berlin, carrying not just fuel, but hope. And that hope, mass-produced, bolted under wings, and dropped into the fields of Europe, was what finally broke the limits of the sky. They called them kites with tin cans. At first, even the pilots laughed. The new tanks looked ridiculous, dull metal pods, bolted beneath the wings of the most advanced fighters in the world. They rattled on takeoff, whined in the wind, and dripped fuel when the temperature dropped. No one trusted them at first. Pilots joked that the tanks would probably blow up before they reached France. But they took them anyway, because there was no choice. In the early months, everything about them was experimental. Mechanics worked through the night, cutting and fitting mounts, sealing joints with layers of tape and glue. Some tanks were made of scrap metal, others of compressed paper coated in varnish. They cost less than a set of tires. But when you're flying into enemy airspace, you don't think about price. You think about distance. On the morning of a mission, pilots would gather in briefing tents, still smelling of fuel and coffee. The maps on the wall showed the familiar black lines stretching eastward. England, the Channel, the French coast, and beyond that, the gray mass of Germany. At the end of that line, circled in red, was Berlin. The briefing officer's words were always the same. We'll have fighter cover all the way in. It sounded like a promise. But to the men who had flown the old missions, It sounded like a miracle. They had seen what it meant when the escorts turned back, when the bombers went alone into the heart of the continent. The empty seats at breakfast told the story better than any briefing could. So when the first squadrons of Mustangs took off with their new tanks, there was tension in the air. No one knew what would happen. The fuel mixture had to be balanced perfectly. Burn the external tanks first, switch to internal reserves at the right altitude, jettison the empties cleanly, and hope the fuel lines didn't freeze. At 15,000 feet, the world was a pale blue void. The condensation froze on the canopies, the air so thin it felt like the sound itself had been drained away. Each pilot reached for the transfer switch, eyes flicking to the gauges. Some tanks fed smoothly. Others coughed, spluttered, or refused to draw at all. One pilot, frustrated, tapped the gauge with his gloved knuckle and muttered, "Come on, don't you quit on me now." When it worked, the sense of relief was electric. The aircraft felt alive again, heavier, slower, but with that invisible promise of more miles. The tanks vibrated under the wings like heartbeat drums. The pilots could almost feel the extra range, a new kind of power humming through the frame. Crossing the North Sea, they watched the coast of England vanish behind them. That was always the loneliest moment, the point of no return. But this time, when they reached the Rhine, they didn't turn back. They kept going. And with every mile, disbelief turned into exhilaration. The German radar stations saw them coming, of course. Blips appeared on screens, sirens wailed, and airfields scrambled fighters. But the pattern was wrong. The escort blips didn't stop at the border. They followed the bombers deeper, further, until the German controllers began to doubt their own eyes. Over Berlin, the first real test began. The flak bursts painted black flowers in the sky. Messerschmitts climbed in twos and threes, circling for position. For the bombers, this was the familiar nightmare. But then the Mustangs came screaming down from altitude, diving into the interceptors before they could even line up. The dogfights that followed were fierce but brief. The P-51s moved with a confidence that came from more than speed. It came from knowing they could stay. For the first time, they didn't have to count the minutes before turning home. They could fight as long as they needed. One German pilot, captured weeks later, said he knew the war was lost the moment he saw an American escort still circling over Berlin after the bombers had gone. "We thought they must have landed somewhere nearby," he said. "We couldn't believe they had come from England." The first few missions proved the concept beyond doubt, but they also revealed the dangers. The drop tanks were fragile. A single tracer round could ignite them like torches. Pilots learned to jettison them early if enemy fire got too close. Some came back missing paint, others with holes where fragments had punched through but not exploded. There were close calls, planes that landed with fumes filling the cockpit, pilots coughing and laughing at their luck. The mechanics adapted fast. They reinforced seams, changed valves, and learned the art of quick mounting. They became as vital to the war effort as the pilots themselves. One ground crew chief in East Anglia became famous for his motto: "If it leaks, seal it. If it breaks, weld it. If it works, don't touch it." The teamwork between pilot and mechanic became sacred. Each trusted the other with his life. Before takeoff, the two would crouch under the wings together, checking connections, listening for the hiss of fuel. A thumbs up, a slap on the fuselage, and the pilot would climb into the cockpit. The mechanic would stand back, hands on hips, watching as his creation rolled down the runway. He'd wait for the tanks to detach cleanly on the return trip, then race out to inspect them. It was a ritual, half science, half superstition. As the missions piled up, something else changed: the psychology of flight. Before the tanks, every deep mission was a gamble. Now there was a sense of control, of rhythm. Pilots began to think of their aircraft not as limited by geography, but as limitless in potential. The world felt smaller, one Mustang ace wrote later. Berlin was no longer far away. It was just over there. For the bomber crews, that change was everything. They could look out their side windows and see silver specks weaving around them. The escorts still there, still guarding. For once, the radio chatter wasn't panic. It was calm coordination. The sky had become an organized machine instead of chaos. The impact on morale was profound. Loss rates fell, confidence soared. Missions that had once been dreaded became routine. Every man who returned alive owed his life, directly or indirectly, to the gallons of fuel carried in those disposable tanks. Even the Germans knew it. Captured pilots spoke of the shock of realizing the Allies had solved the range problem. One Luftwaffe officer told his interrogators, "We used to wait for the escorts to leave. We would count the minutes. After that, we owned the sky. Now, there is no after." And indeed, there wasn't. The Allied offensive in the air no longer stopped at the front lines. It went everywhere. Rail yards, fuel depots, airfields, bridges. With every passing week, the circle of destruction closed tighter around the Reich. By late 1944, the drop tanks had become symbols of inevitability. Each one represented more than fuel. It represented reach, persistence, dominance. The Luftwaffe's best hope had always been that the Allies would exhaust themselves before reaching the homeland. Instead, they brought the homeland to exhaustion. When the war finally turned irreversibly against Germany, the historians would later say that it was the industrial might of the United States and the courage of its airmen that broke the enemy. But those who were there knew better. They knew it was something smaller, humbler, almost laughably simple, a cheap little tank of gas that could be built in a day, carried for hours, and dropped in a second. To the men who flew with them, those tanks weren't just equipment. They were lifelines. They were the silent third crew member, the unseen partner that carried them through the worst skies on Earth. And long after the shooting stopped, when they stood beside the old planes in museums, it wasn't the guns or the engines they looked at first. It was the pylons under the wings. That was where the war had turned. That was where the impossible became possible. The war ended, but the habit of looking at the fuel gauge never left the men who'd flown it. Long after the last raids, they still caught themselves glancing at dashboard dials in cars or planes, hearing in their heads the low hiss of a tank feeding its last drops through a line of cold metal. For them, the story of the war was written in miles, and every one of those miles had been bought with fuel carried in something no one had expected to matter. When historians talk about the Second World War, they usually describe it in terms of hardware and heroes. The Spitfire, the B-17, the Tiger tank, the Sherman. They talk about breakthroughs in code breaking, radar, and nuclear physics. But tucked beneath all of that, almost invisible, is the small, disposable invention that made the strategy of the air war possible. The drop tank never appeared in propaganda films. It wasn't sleek or romantic. It was a piece of plumbing. And yet, it carried the war farther than any weapon before it. It gave commanders something new: time. Time to plan longer routes. Time for escorts to linger. Time for bombers to strike deeper targets. Every extension of range reshaped the map of Europe. When you can reach Berlin, every other city suddenly feels closer. The drop tank didn't just help the Allies win. It changed what victory looked like. It made air power truly strategic. The engineers understood it first. After the surrender, when captured German aircraft were brought to Allied test fields, technicians found notes in the logbooks where Luftwaffe officers had scribbled desperate calculations about range, endurance, and external fuel options. They had known what was killing them. They simply couldn't manufacture the solution fast enough. Their factories were bombed, their aluminum was gone, and their war economy couldn't spare the metal for anything so mundane as a jettisonable fuel tank. The Allies could. That difference in resources became a difference in survival. In the months after V-Day, Allied intelligence officers toured German airfields and saw the irony for themselves. Scattered among the wrecks of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts were empty American drop tanks, rusting in the weeds. They were the remains of the long escort missions that had broken the Luftwaffe's back. A few German officers picked them up, turned them over in their hands, and muttered that they wished they'd thought of them first. The post-war generation of pilots inherited those lessons as instinct. To them, range was everything. Every new fighter and bomber, every reconnaissance jet and nuclear deterrent was designed around how far it could fly and how quickly it could refuel. The droppable tank under a Mustang's wing became the detachable pod under a Phantom, the conformal tank on an F-15, the aerial refueling probe on an F-35. The shape changed, the material changed, but the logic was identical. Distance is power. Even outside the military, the idea spread. Civilian airliners adopted auxiliary fuel systems. Commercial pilots talked about drop tank discipline, calculating weight and range the way wartime flyers once had. The airlines that would eventually connect London to New York and Tokyo to Los Angeles did, so using principles born over the gray skies of Europe. Every intercontinental flight is, in a way, a descendant of those first missions that reached Berlin. For the men who lived it, though, the meaning stayed personal. In reunions decades later, they still talked about the moment the drop tanks went dry and tumbled away into the clouds. They described the sudden lift, the clean acceleration, the sense that the aircraft itself was exhaling. Some remembered the sound, an almost musical thunk, as the clamps released. Others remembered looking down and watching the tanks spiral toward the earth, little silver coins falling through the sun. Those tanks were the last thing they saw before the real fight began. And when they landed, when the engines cooled and the ground crews rolled the planes into their bays, they'd look up at the empty pylons and nod to each other. The mission had worked. The cheap little tanks had done their job again. They never gave them names, never painted them with nose art. They were too temporary for that. But every pilot knew, without them, the sky would have belonged to someone else. Today, the museums tell the story with polished aircraft and neat labels. The visitors come for the glamour of the Mustang and the roar of its engine. But if you look closely, beneath the wings are two modest cylinders, dull and gray. Most people don't notice them, but the veterans always do. They lean a little closer, trace the lines of the mounts with a fingertip, and smile. To them, that's the real memorial, not the medals or the uniforms, but those forgotten shells that carried them into history. Because in the end, it wasn't just courage or numbers that brought the war to Berlin. It was endurance, measured in gallons of miles. It was the understanding that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is the simplest thing in the world: enough fuel to come home. That's why the story of the drop tank still matters. It's a reminder that innovation doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it's a mechanic's sketch on a piece of scrap metal, a field modification that makes sense only when everything else has failed. Sometimes it's an idea so cheap that no one bothers to patent it, and yet it changes the map of the world. The wooden plane that could not be seen, the bomber that rolled its bomb sideways past flak, the fighter that carried its own horizon under its wings. All of them came from the same spirit. Invention born from necessity. The drop tank was its purest form. It didn't just let pilots reach Berlin. It let them return, and it taught every generation after that the only real limit in the sky is imagination. So when the engines start up at an air show and an old Mustang lifts into the blue, look beneath its wings. There they are, two small tanks, silent and unremarkable. They're the reason the war ended sooner. The reason the city that was once unreachable became just another waypoint on a flight plan. They are proof that even in the largest conflict in human history, victory can hang from something as simple, as ordinary, as a cheap little gas tank.